Welcome back. We're on chapter 14 now. We've lost a couple of the wagon train people, and now we're ready to see what's going on. Okay, chapter 14. Here we go. What do you think of our moving on today? I heard Father asking in a low voice as I opened my eyes the next morning. Remember that she just had a baby. I couldn't quite make out Mother's reply. I would rather not, Father went on, but it is already the end of September. We are a whole month later than we planned. And at Fort Hall, they warned us of snowstorms beginning in October in the mountains. For a moment, there was silence. Then Mother answered in a small but firm voice. The baby and I can ride as well on this feather bed as not. So that morning after breakfast, we moved on again. Father traveled slowly so as not to jolt the wagon too much, and stopped often to make sure that Mother and the little Elijah were all right. Mother's face was still tired and ghostly pale, but the baby slept as sweetly as if he were being rocked in a downy cradle. Jesse Clark remained very sick. John drove his wagon now, while Rebecca, the eldest of the McReynolds children, herded their few loose cattle. A few days after that, we reached the Columbia River. We came upon it just at dusk after a hard day of travel through the dry, dusty hills. I stood on the river's sandy banks, where not a tree nor a blade of grass grew, and looked out over the rushing gray-blue water. I was amazed at how wide and powerful it was, and grateful that we would not have to cross it. Surely, I thought, we must be almost to the end of our journey, for this was the river Father had talked about in those long ago days when he first dreamed of going to Oregon. Yes, he agreed, with a trace of a tired smile when I asked him. We still have a few more mountains to cross, difficult ones, but it won't be so long now. Jesse Clark would not cross the last range of mountains. He died that night. Once more, from inside the wagon, I heard the sounds of low, mournful singing. When I asked Father what funeral hymn they sang, he told me, There is a land of pure delight. I nodded. Somehow it comforted me to think that Jesse was with his mother and father now in that promised land. On the next day, the Clark wagon was left behind, the three remaining Clarks riding with Mrs. McReynolds and her children. Wearily, ploddingly, we pushed on, and still our troubles were not over. Sometimes I thought I was trapped in some strange and terrible nightmare, and no matter how many times I pinched myself, I could never wake up, because now it was Father who had taken sick. For several days he had been feverish, but he refused to give in to it. He dragged along, driving the team, building the fires, taking care of Mother and the baby. But finally, one afternoon, after making camp, he could do no more. He fell into bed, groaning with fever. That evening, John had to do everything, even the cooking. He put up the tent for Father to sleep in, took care of the animals, did the milking, then prepared a supper for us of fried bacon and mush. I looked around at the plate, at the same old food, hidden under a dark puddle of molasses. I was so tired of it. As I picked up my spoon, somehow the thought of a potato crept in my mind. I was so hungry that I could eat a whole peck of them, and not even cooked, just raw, or that cabbage from the Indian's garden. I could still see it inside my head, round and plump and deep green. My kingdom for a cabbage, I sighed to myself as I scraped the last spoonful of mush from my tin plate. Mother must have been having the same thoughts. Later that night, after John finally returned from taking care of the animals, I heard her talking to him from the bed in the wagon. I am so hungry, John, she said. Can't you get me something more to eat? I'll try to cook up some cornbread in the frying pan, he answered. A few minutes later, he sighed gratefully. Thank you, John. That tastes so good. When I got up the next morning and saw what was left in the frying pan, I was amazed. The cornbread was only half cooked. Mother must have been awfully hungry to think that tasted good. In any other time, John and I would have had a good laugh about it. This morning, though, there seemed nothing to laugh at. The day was cold and raw, the sky a heavy gray. I shivered as I walked around, gathering sticks for the fire. We had to finish the cornbread for breakfast, as there was nothing else. Cynthia refused to eat it. Don't like it, she whimpered. No good. Worst of all, Father was no better. He lay in bed inside the tent, the same tent where Lavina had lain when she was so sick. I couldn't help remembering, muttering and moaning with fever. I took him a cup of tea, but he pushed it away, hardly seeming to recognize me. What were we going to do, I wondered. as I walked back to the fire. Should we wait for Father to recover or try to move on? Could we move on? Mother lay in bed in the wagon, still too weak to do anything except take care of the baby, and Mrs. McReynolds had not recovered from the deaths of Captain and Mrs. Clark and Jessie. Though she was strong in body, her mind seemed clouded. She waited mutely for Father to tell her what to do. Last night, John had taken all the burden on his thin shoulders, but it was too much for him all alone. I could tell by his bent back and his anxious look in his eyes as he hurried from one chore to another. He too was waiting for Father to tell him what to do. We all depended on Father. It was his strength that had brought us this far. Now suddenly it was gone. Just then I heard him cry out again from the tent. "No!" he groaned as if he were in agony. "No!" A shiver of dread ran all the way through me. Could this be the beginning of his delirium? As if I had opened a tightly sealed box, all kinds of terrible thoughts came tumbling out, one on top of another. Captain Clark raving with madness day after day. Mrs. Clark's lonely grave. Oxen so weak and worn out that they could not stand, lying helpless on the trail. Dead Indians piled up in teepees. Sad, quiet funeral hymns sung by fewer and fewer people. For the first time in all our long journey, I thought we might not make it after all. What would we do if Father should die? I looked up into the sky. Through the gray mist of the clouds off to the west, I could make out the dim outline of rugged mountain peaks. Father had told me their names: Mount Hood, Mount Jefferson, Mount St. Helens. And I remembered his words to Mother a few days back. At Fort Hall, they warned of snowstorms beginning in October in the mountains. All at once, I knew what Father would say if he could. I hurried to find John. I think they're going to be moving on. We have to keep moving, I told him. I will help. That day was the hardest of all the hard days of our journey. John drove the wagon. Father lay in the back, still tossing and turning and crying out fitfully. Mother sat propped up with pillows in front, Elijah in her arms and Cynthia close by. I herded our loose stock and took care of Father and Mother's needs and found scraps of bread and bacon for lunch. With Lavina's help, tried to do all the things I had watched Mother doing for the past months. The oxen, sore-necked and sore-footed and bone-weary, seemed scarcely able to move. Walking along behind the wagon, I concentrated on just putting one foot down in front of the other. Left foot, right foot. One step closer to Oregon. Another step closer. Now do it again. Left foot, right foot. Into my tired brain crept a picture of Grandma. It seemed as if I could see her a long time ago, a little bit of a thing trudging along beside her young husband through the dense forest, across wide rivers and icy streams, into the lonely wilderness that was Indiana. Maybe she had felt something like I felt now. Not really brave. Probably it took a long time to become brave, and I was still full of fears. But just doing what had to be done, facing west and putting one foot in front of the other, not giving up, making it through, enduring. We made only 4 or 5 miles that day. Still, I told myself it was 4 or 5 miles closer to where we were going. That evening, while John did the milking, I managed to cook up some cornmeal mush for supper. I took a plate to Mother, and she smiled when she saw it. "You did this, Mary Ellen?" she said softly. "You must have been watching me more carefully than I thought." Then her eyes filled with tears. "You have done so much today to help. I don't know how we would have managed without you." I could feel myself standing straighter and taller as I went to the tent to give Father his cup of tea. This time he was able to drink it. Though his face was flushed, which meant he still had fever, he seemed a little better. "Thank you," he whispered, trying to smile. Father passed the night peacefully, and the next morning he seemed better again. John and I looked at each other, and in his eyes I saw the relief I felt. The worst was over, I thought. Father's fever had broken. Every day after that, Father slowly improved. Soon he was sitting up and once more telling John what to do. A few days after that, he was able to drive the train, sitting up on the spring seat. It was good to see him there, even if he was not his usual cheerful self. He was so quiet and looked so very weary. And so we managed to drag ourselves along until we reached the Dalles. This was a small trading post located at a notch in the high hills that ran along the Columbia River. It looked like a jumping-off place, with nowhere to jump but into the river. There was a Methodist mission there, a few tumble-down cabins and tents, a handful of Frenchmen and Indian wives, and that was all. All the same, the Dalles was a busy place. 24 or more families were camped there. Their wagons and tents fanned out on the flat ground. Children were running around, most without shoes, while the women visited and rested, did the washing, and tried to cook some different meals with rice from the trading post and fish they had bought from the Indians. A hospital was set up in one tent, and it was filled with the sick. The men were busy taking apart wagons and repairing them, and planning what came next. For here, Father had told us, every traveler had to make a choice. Some would continue the journey by wagon over the rugged Cascade Mountains, while others floated the rest of the way by boat or raft down the Columbia River. Father had decided long ago that we would try to cross over the mountains. We thought Mrs. McReynolds would come with us, but while we were camped at the Dales, she met a family from the town next to hers back in Ohio. They were planning to go the rest of the way by flatboat, and she decided to join them. Are you sure? Father asked, looking at her with concern. You know you are welcome to come with us. Something seemed to have come over Mrs. McReynolds in the last few days, I thought. It was as if she had awakened from a long sleep, and those eyes had been so dull I saw a new spark of life. I am sure, she replied firmly. Lavinia and I went down to the river to watch as her wagon and 2 others were taken apart, then loaded piece by piece into flatboats. On the bottom of the boat went the running gear. Next came the wagon beds, and then their covers removed. On top of this were piled all the remaining food and provisions, and finally would come the passengers, packed in tight like sardines in a box. Early the next morning, as they loaded the last of their belongings on board, we said goodbye to Mrs. McReynolds and the 8 children. They were many sizes, from tall, sturdy, pink-cheeked Rebecca down to sad-eyed little Willie, with fair hair and dark, but all one family now. This parting was the hardest of all. Our families had shared so much sorrow and joy, and helped each other through the most difficult times. Mrs. McReynolds' face was flushed with feeling, and she held tight to Willie's hand as she thanked Father and Mother for their help. If you had not stayed with us, we would never have made it to this place, she said simply. Mother was too overcome to speak, but Father answered quietly, We wish you Godspeed. We waved goodbye as the heavily loaded boats moved precariously out onto the rushing river. It was strange, I thought. Even as we had started our journey alone, it seemed that we were going to finish it the same way. Then slowly we walked back to our wagon to prepare to cross the last mountains. End of chapter 14. They said goodbye to another family again, and now they're preparing themselves to go over the Cascade Mountains. This will be interesting.